Bitcoin developers are fighting again. They might never have stopped fighting, but this past 2 weeks, there is something spicy going on. They're fighting about something which is very technical. I did an episode on this earlier this week with Udi Wertmer, and now we're going to reprise it on Writer's Room. Me and Claude are going to talk about the OPReTURN Wars. Bitcoin Season 2 is brought to you by Arch Network, the platform building bridgeless apps on Bitcoin. More on Arch later on the show. Let's kick it off.
There's blood in the streets. And like you said, there's more infighting than usual. I'm struggling to think of a time when devs were as fired up as they are now about something, right? Taproot was pretty agreed upon. There weren't very good criticisms against it. Not that there are necessarily good criticisms against this, but like Taproot wasn't that controversial. Seg was not that controversial. Covenants haven't been that controversial. People just seem to think either they are a waste of time or maybe that there isn't enough utility for them yet. The last thing I can think of that really sparked this much vociferous debate was probably the block size wars, circa 2016.
Yeah, it is weird that the most analogous community infighting, because this is now exceeded just like the Bitcoin technical discourse, so like the mailing list and the GitHub. It's now on Twitter, and the sides there are lines drawn, and there is a wide amount of Bitcoiners saying that this would spell the end of Bitcoin. And I am very surprised to hear that. Just out the gate, I'm not a neutral participant in this. I'm very opinionated. I've made my opinions very clear, and I've tried to, accumulate, resources to explain the topic. And I will, but just for the listener, like, I'm not impartial here. I don't know actually where you kind of fall in the line, on this issue, Colin, but maybe to set it out, you just disclose your biases, and then we can explain what it is.
I personally think that people should only be using Bitcoin if they not only run their own node, but mine the coins themselves to pay for goods and services. Hopefully on a node software that they spun up themselves on their personal computer. I think that it's only halal if it's coins that you mined and they are sent through your own node. And I think spending Bitcoin on anything except for stake and tithing to your local church is haram. So no, but in all seriousness, I probably align with you on this almost entirely. But for the sake of this, I'll try to take the other side of the argument every now and then in the debate, because I do think there are legitimate concerns with certain developers in the sense of trying to keep Bitcoin, for lack of a better word, pure to its intended use case with Satoshi, right? It's primarily a monetary network for financial transactions. That being said, there's another side of me that realizes that ultimately, if people find alternative uses for block space to increase Bitcoin's tooling and to increase its utility, that's just going to happen. And kind of fighting it is almost like trying to fight gravity while jumping out of a tree. But, and then there's the other side of me, right, who's mined Bitcoin in the past, and we cover mining a lot here. Bitcoin would benefit from some of these other use cases because right now, very few people are using the chain. Fees are very low. So if we want to have healthy block subsidies in the future when the block reward dwindles, then, we want to make sure that people are using the chain and actually paying those fees, or else miners won't be incentivized to keep it up. But I probably agree with you on this, but we should start with just exactly what the disagreement is.
Actually, we should take a little credit here because we did kind of start it. So what happened was some of the Bitcoin core devs were at our conference, which we promoted on this podcast a lot, Up Next, and they listened to a technical presentation from Ekram Ball at Citrea. Citrea is a Bitcoin rollup. I had Orkin on this podcast previously, and Ekram, his co-founder, explained, here's how we are planning to design the rollup on Bitcoin. And basically, it needs to put some data on Bitcoin, and we need to be able to have availability of that data to acquire it whenever. And we could use this one place for arbitrary data on Bitcoin called the OPReTURN, but it's not big enough according to relay policy, which we'll get into. So we're going to take a little bit of the extra data that we would post, and we're going to put that in unspendable outputs that are just going to kind of accrue onto Bitcoin for forever. And some Bitcoin core devs were listening to this and said, oh, well, the OPReTURN relay policy limit is, as they say, arbitrarily small, but the consensus of how big an OPReTURN can be is much bigger, and we don't see a reason why that shouldn't be changed. Let's propose changing it. So this erupted into extreme debate because this would be posting non-financial data on Bitcoin. Well, it would actually more like being posting condensed financial data on Bitcoin. But this turned into the topic of spam. And there are some people who are at the forefront of criticizing this. And it is the same cast of characters who we've talked about on this podcast who have been kind of at the forefront of the spam is bad on Bitcoin. We need to do everything we can to disincentivize this socially and technically. And so I will stop there and toss it to you, Colin, to add some extra context.
Yeah, so I think it's important to contextualize exactly what OPReTURN does. So when we talk about arbitrary data, we're talking about data that you can insert into Bitcoin transactions that have really nothing to do with the actual transactions themselves, right? There's nothing related to the UTXOs used for the transaction, to the sender address and the recipient address. But OPReTURN has been used for a number of things in the past, messages on Bitcoin. If people wanted to just leave something, Bitcoin developer Ben Carman had an OPReTURN bot that I guess is still in use, but people could just go.
It's popping off right now. Yeah, it's popping off right now.
And you could pay to use it, and then you could it would create a custom transaction for you where you could just write anything as long as it was within an 83 byte limit. And more recently, in terms of the spam conversation, OPReTURN has been used for runes, these these fungible tokens on Bitcoin that were launched by Casey Rodamore. And that's something that I think we should dissect a little bit later. I find the spam arguments to be interesting because the spam that people traditionally think of with ordinals and inscriptions, as far as I know, Charlie, don't even need OPReTURN necessarily. Because am I wrong in thinking that? Like, I guess it depends on the
particular
standard.
Fungible token standard, which is the driver of the majority of these near dust outputs, is the BRC20 scheme. And it continues to this day. In fact, Casey's runes idea was a direct response to that, saying here's a less harmful way to do this activity.
Yeah, so that's the thing that I find most interesting about some of the people pushing back against this, citing spam, because if you look at some of the data bloat that we've seen from inscriptions, BRC20s, etc., they don't even use the OPReTURN field for the inscriptions, whether that be actual NFTs or whether that be other fungible token standards like BRC20. So without getting ahead of ourselves a little bit too much, the idea behind relaxing the OPReTURN limit is that you will open up new use cases like rollups with Citria, and you will kind of do away with something that is arbitrary and was just put in place just to have a number there. And in doing so, you'll also reduce potential UTXO bloat, because to go back to what Charlie was saying, if Citria wants to roll out rollups on Bitcoin currently, they use as much OPReTURN data as they can, and then they use unspendable UTXO outputs, which you can't touch after they've been committed, to create those rollups. So in a world where Citria is launching and gaining traction without a relax to the OPReTURN limit, you would basically have potentially indefinite UTXO bloat as people open up roll-up channels and close them. And that would have to happen anytime that there was any sort of activity to create or close a roll-up.
Yeah, and I'll note that Citria did not request this. This was organically the result of some of these devs listening to the Citria presentation and then looking at the other types of things like Citria, which are happening already, where you have a lot of what are called out-of-band transactions or non-standard transactions being handed straight to the block producers, the mining pools themselves, and getting into blocks. Now, this is generally considered bad when it happens at scale. I've had Portland Hoddle of Slipstream, a product of Marathon, here on the show talking about how he built this. And so this is where you have private mempools that these miners pull from and put those transactions into blocks. And these transactions are not broadcast through the network of nodes. So these transactions are never seen by the majority of nodes. And so in anticipation of that increasing, because it's already been happening at a gradually increasing level, certain developers who are contributors to Bitcoin Core said, let's relax the rules, the policy rules for which our client, the Bitcoin Core client, allows transactions to be relayed so that they better match consensus, because these transactions are going to happen anyway. And we want all nodes to have a very good view of what the Bitcoin blocks will look like. This has multiple reasons from an engineering standpoint and from a view from the perspective of keeping Bitcoin permissionless and accessible to people who run nodes.
And yeah, to bring this back to the source before we get into some of the nitty gritty and the nuances, this is the original Bitcoin development mailing list post from Antoine Wanceau about relaxing the OPReTURN restrictions. So right now, the OPReTURN restriction is 83 bytes. Antoine, and later echoed by Peter Todd, are proposing to raise it to, is it 1 megabyte, Charlie? Is that the size,
it would be that which is consensus valid. So it's effectively 1 megabyte. Technically, it's like a few thousand bytes smaller, but whatever. Doesn't matter.
Yeah. So anyway, they're proposing to expand it for the reasons that Charlie just said. So this would accommodate some of these new use cases in a way where the entire network could see and propagate them. And to go back to what Charlie was just saying there about some of the engineering challenges, if these payments are made out of band payments are sent directly to a mining pool or a miner for inclusion in a block. So they are not propagated through the global network of mempools the way normal transactions are, right? When you go from your wallet or Coinbase or something and you want to send a transaction.
Can I pause you and say that there's non-standard and then out of band. Out of band refers to the payment for the transactions, and non-standard refers to a transaction which would not normally be propagated through the network of nodes because they wouldn't hand it off to the next one. However, they often recently have been going hand in hand because it's just a better way to take payment for these types of transactions.
Right, but so non-standard transactions would have to be out of band if they wanted to get propagated though, right?
Not necessarily. You can hand a non-standard transaction to a miner with sufficient fees within that same transaction. And so you can send that transaction hex straight to a miner and they'll include it. And that also includes the fee captured by the miner in that block.
Right. I guess where I'm like kind of, and you obviously know this better than I do, but my whole point is that regardless, you have to go to a miner to get.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
the short version, you just you pay the miner directly and you hand the transaction to the miner. And so you're effectively paying them directly. The difference is not really relevant, I think, for this particular discussion.
Okay. So let's try to, roll this back to, to right before what I'm about to say now.
It's kind of interesting because I don't know, Colin, because I think this is relevant because it does get into some technical obscurity. And this is one of the reasons why it's really, this actually may be good to keep in to help explain that a lot of this has to do with the kind of weird technical discussions that the Bitcoin devs have on the mailing list, which whenever normal people, even people who spend all their time looking and thinking about Bitcoin, have to come in and try to understand what's happening and why the devs are doing things, they are mystified. And this is why, as they immediately go to their favorite Bitcoin influencer who can shovel whatever narrative they want into their minds. And this is why it's very difficult to refute incorrect technical statements and claims, which is why, as Udi says, this actually does, as frustrating as it is to me, this does become a social disagreement. And he does really get right to the big picture, which is that Bitcoin Core has not it has not preserved the trust that it used to have 5 or 6 years ago. The majority of the newer Bitcoin participant in the past half decade has come into Bitcoin with no like respect and deference to the authority that Bitcoin Core has had in the first decade of Bitcoin. And this is really, really on display now as people are defecting, running alternate clients, specifically Bitcoin knots.
Wait, this is all really good, but we need to get back, make sure that we're...
Yeah. Okay, sorry.
Without the OPReTURN limit being relaxed for some of these transactions that developers or users want to make that are non-standard within Bitcoin Core, they would have to go directly to miners to make sure those transactions are mined. So they would basically take the transaction to the miner, pay them a fee out of band, and these out of band payments are ways in which they can circumvent the global network of mempools and get the transaction directly to the miner, where in a situation where if they just sent the transaction that didn't conform, it wouldn't be propagated. Now, going back to what Charlie said earlier, this creates really two big problems, two quantifiable ones, and a third that's more qualitative, but still nonetheless important. Number one, if those transactions aren't relayed through everyone's mempools, it takes nodes longer to sync with blocks that are mined with those transactions because they don't have that data on hand already. So it increases latency. Number two, it also messes with fee estimation. If you had, just using a kind of extreme use case, if you had like 10% even of transactions on Bitcoin going out of band, then your node is not factoring in those transactions when it is running fee estimation, or your wallet isn't either. So you may underbid your fee and have to wait longer for your transaction to be included on chain. So it completely messes with fee estimation because you don't actually see what the fee for that payment is because it's paid directly to the miner. It's not included within the mempool data. And the third one, which is that more qualitative one, it kind of circumvents the entire, obviously the whole network, the entire structure of the network propagation, right? So it incentivizes users to establish direct lines with mining pools. And that kind of opens up the door to where you could undermine the permissionless nature of Bitcoin, as quoted here by Mike Smith, the Brink executive director. Quote, and in particular, this again shifts profits towards large miners. So you kind of mess with Bitcoin's censorship resistant properties. But before we launch into some more of the pros and go in the cons against relaxing the OPReTURN limit, Charlie, maybe you could give our listeners a quick rundown on the different types of transaction standardness within Bitcoin Core, because this is something that I think people completely either miss or it's not really talked about enough. And it's something that the whole ordinals and inscriptions debate has blown wide open as well.
This is in the blog that I wrote earlier this week on blockspace.media, but basically a valid transaction is any transaction which is considered valid by Bitcoin consensus. So any transaction that can go into a Bitcoin block. A standard transaction is a subset of valid transactions. It's when a Bitcoin Core sees that standard transaction, it will relay that transaction and hand it off to the next one. And that standard transaction would theoretically find its way into a Bitcoin block. A non-standard transaction is when a Bitcoin Core node sees a valid transaction, but it does not relay that transaction to the next node because it may consider a denial of service attack. It may just not conform to its arbitrary limitations. There's a number of reasons. And then there are clear DOS or denial of service or like transactions which are bad to Bitcoin. I call these DOS transactions. And that these are valid transactions, but would actually severely harm Bitcoin. Now, there is a debate, if I could get to the heart of it, as to whether a JPEG or an inscription, an ordinal, is a DOS or a hostile transaction or not. This is one of the core debates of this whole discussion, and it's not related to the specific pull request that is for the OPReTURN limit, but it's about the slightly more meta discussion of do JPEGs harm Bitcoin?
And I think that really does. we've gotten into it on Twitter and elsewhere with Luke Dasher before about this. The whole concept of spam, ultimately boils down to a semantics argument, I believe. And I think you would probably agree with me here, because Luke, in the past, I asked him a question about this at the Nashville Energy Summit, I believe last year. And I said, well, isn't your concept of spam just another man's treasure? Basically saying this boils down to what your definition of spam is. To me, if you think about like email spam, it is an unwanted message that has no clear use other than clogging up your inbox or aggravating the recipient, right? That's why I don't think that JPEGs and inscriptions fit that bill, because whether or not you want it on the blockchain and whether or not you like it being there, the fact of the matter is these are active market participants trading things that they find of value, right? And so ultimately there's a value attached to these things, and they are either inscribing them or trading them in real time. So like, I don't think that you can say someone who is buying or selling something that they are ascribing a value to can be considered spam, because the actual use of that good or use of that JPEG kind of transcends normal spam, which is just waste sent to try to either overload a system or distract a recipient, right? So, but that's kind of like you said, at the heart of this whole conversation.
The way Bitcoin's has addressed spam is saying, okay, we have what is Bitcoin, a valid Bitcoin transaction. It fits within the Bitcoin consensus, this box. And the network itself has a lot of difficulty distinguishing what is spam and what is not. It has difficulty actually distinguishing between what is arbitrary data and what is financial data. People will eviscerate me for this, but I'm willing to actually argue this point. And the way we have the method we've used to mitigate the level of spam and useless activity is through Bitcoin's fee market. It costs money in the native token of the system to transact on Bitcoin. So there is a natural fee pressure to disincentivize frivolous use. One, I think, defining feature of spam is that it is kind of frivolous and that it's not very costly to produce. Not only is it unwanted. So Bitcoin's fee market acts as a check against too much spam, which is both frivolity and asymmetrically easy to produce. Because if we want to look at actually how much money's been spent on putting these on Bitcoin, it's significant. We're going to look at the number of transactions in the past year, 2 years. They've been between 30 and 45% of all transactions by number on Bitcoin. So this is significant activity, and this now represents a significant number of Bitcoin users. So I think another assumption of spam is if there's 100 people and 99 of them are doing something and one person is spamming everybody, then you can kind of identify that as spam. But if over a third of the entire room is using Bitcoin for another thing and they're paying for that block space, you have a really hard time convincing me that is semantically spam. So it's almost like the system is a product of what it is, and it is currently being used in part for JPEGs.
And I like the point about frivolity, because if we look at the ordinals market, for instance, right, and look at some of these top collections, you'll notice that and with other things too, like runes and BRC20s, when the fee rate supersedes reasonable expectations of profit for minting these things, people stop minting them, transaction volume goes down, and suddenly these transactions are not sent through the network anymore because traders aren't making money on them. Investors are not seeing them as a good opportunity. So to your point about the fee market, these things kind of have gotten filtered out over time as we've seen the ordinals and inscriptions market pretty much collapse. It's in a state of dormancy currently. And
even then, there's still a third of the transactions on Bitcoin today. In its collapsed state, it is still outbidding, it is like not just material, it's like a major part of what Bitcoin's transaction graph looks like today.
Yeah, that's a good point. And this goes back to an argument in the pro spam or the pro inscriptions and ordinals or alternative use of block space camp, right? They say, well, because of the fee market, anyone can partake in the network and you have to pay your way in. And if you want more monetary or financial transactions on Bitcoin, then let's see the use cases for them, right? Let's try to prioritize those things, because eventually monetary and financial transactions will price out any other use of block space over time. And to try to play devil's advocate here, I do sympathize some with the filters crowd, in the sense that ultimately Bitcoin is its most powerful if it is used as a censorship resistant, permissionless monetary system for payments that you can't make anywhere else, right? For people to store their value in a currency that is detached from central bank whims and fancies. But then to kind of throw all of that out the window, what I find really interesting is that, we've been talking about inscriptions and ordinals, but ultimately the OPReTURN debate doesn't even rest on that as a use case, because Citrea wants to use it for rollups, which is a type of layer 2 on Bitcoin. So to me, it's kind of a self-defeating argument to anchor this in the spam debate for the camp that is against increasing the OPReTURN limit, because what you would essentially be doing is you would be creating an environment that allows people to more efficiently anchor these layer 2s to Bitcoin, which would increase its financial footprint, assuming those took off.
The claims are literally from the representatives of the filter camp are literally that this is because the Bitcoin core devs are compromised, and this is because there is a conspiracy among spam apologists and spam provocateurs to destroy, literal quotes, destroy Bitcoin via this policy adjustment. And the irony is, none of us asked for it. It's kind of like it would be a minor to moderate optimization for the Bitcoin core client on the short term. And then also, it never really made sense to for JPEGers or spammers, if you will, to put all this data in OPReTURN, for the main reason that OPReTURN is actually more expensive to use than the witness space on Bitcoin. So it's actually more expensive to put your JPEG in OPReTURN than it is to put it in witness, which brings a whole nother discussion about the pricing of block space. And this is another rabbit hole which we do not have to go down. Maybe to more productively focus this, I think Udi does get into, he does bring up a really good point in the most previous interview that I had with him, which is he says that this is about, in a previous Bitcoin world, you would have all the Bitcoiners go, oh yeah, this is what Core wants to do. This is just the best idea. We all look to Core for guidance. And if they want to do something, even an obscure technical change, everyone's like, yeah, sure. But now we're in a regime where Core is realizing they do not have control over the narrative and trust of the community as much as they thought they did. And this is the community saying, we don't care. We don't actually understand any of the stuff you're talking about. And because we don't, we're going to go fork off out of a misguided sense of purity. And I actually think that's, as much as I try to zero in on the technical side, that is actually probably a more important conversation to have. Let me tell you about one of the most slept on opportunities in crypto. Arch is building fast, composable DeFi apps on Bitcoin. Arch apps tap into the OG blockchain with by far the most liquidity and best brand in crypto. I've known the team for over a year. The tech they're building is solid, and they are racing towards mainnet. There's DEXs like Saturn, meme coins on FunkyBit.fun, instant loans on Cha-Ching, and so much more. Plus, they're rewarding testnet users, so join me in trying out Arch while it's still early.
All right, so we've covered the pros for relaxing the OPReTURN limit. Let's close out on a few of the cons, and we've had a little bit of discussion during this pod about some of those and how we think that they're a little bit self-defeating or even misled. But we'll try to be as gracious as possible and give the steel man for why the OPReTURN limit shouldn't be relaxed. Charlie, maybe you want to kick it off because you covered this in depth, and then we'll go into some of the more, how should we say, colorful and imaginative interpretations of what spam is doing on the blockchain.
I actually do have a view on why it shouldn't be relaxed, which is genuinely my own, which is that it wasn't really necessary. It is an optimization and something which I think maybe may be good and proactive to do, but it's not really necessary. I know we change mempool policy regularly, but this was not really asked for by anyone. It is still not a until this past week of Barbara Streisanding the nature of the OPReTURN size limit. It was really not utilized a ton. It was still kind of this edge case. So it was not a super necessary thing to do. Then there is the angle that, and this is just depends on who you talk to, that allowing people to put more data on in a more reliable way, whether or not you endorse it or not, allows that to happen more freely, when the argument is that we should do all that we can to disincentivize non-financial, non-monetary data. So relaxing the OPReTURN mempool relay size limit could, in theory, make it easier for people to put large OPReTURNs. So, and therefore, larger amounts of arbitrary data. That's the high-level argument. And I think the responses to that are pretty nuanced. What about you? What are some other takes on this?
As far as I can tell, you sum it up pretty well in this article. Most of the arguments are, as you say here, of a philosophical or personal nature. As far as I can tell, the technical arguments are not as strong as in the pro relaxing the OPReTURN limit camp. You can make an argument that you do open up the blockchain for larger transactions that include non-monetary data. And so that's perhaps a technical argument, but I do think that there's a Venn diagram there where you get a lot of philosophical musings on what Bitcoin is supposed to be for, right? And again, I do kind of fall into the camp of like, I think that Bitcoin is its most impactful if we keep it as a censorship resistant, permissionless network for financial transactions. But with censorship resistance and permissionlessness, you open up the door to whatever people want to use it for. As you said earlier in the episode, as long as you pay the fee, you get in the block, right? And that's there for a reason. So as far as I can tell, most of the arguments really are almost emotional as well. And it kind of, to me, it plays into the, for lack of a better term, the wokenization of every corner of political, social, and cultural life, right? I mean, Bitcoiners, as much as they like to rave against, some of them rave against the woke left and other things like that, right? There is this contingent of Bitcoiners that have these sacred cows that you dare not even look at them, right? Or dare not speak their name in polite conversation. Block size has been one of them. And I think this is becoming one of them too, or at least the spam debate versus the filters are useless debate is becoming one of those things, right? Like most of the arguments are really emotional. They rely on kind of knee-jerk reactions, weaponized empathy, and things of that nature. So all that being said, just to go back to your article, to read one of the technical arguments, and I quote you from this article, quote, technical arguments say that spam is undesirable and should be discouraged. And the following is a quote from Chris Gita, quote, we don't need to make sure no spam ever reaches the blockchain. That is, of course, impossible. All we need to do is show active hostility to the spammers, and the worst schemes, the ones that rely on consistent transaction format, will be impossible to maintain and therefore will lose funding, end quote, argues Bitcoin developer Chris Gita. This almost makes it there. Like it's like almost to the point of where
that's a pretty good argument. It's a pretty good argument that if we actively show hostility towards as he defines spammers, then it will disincentivize it. That's actually a really good argument. But it comes down to, again, what is spam? Like we literally fundamentally disagree on what spam is.
Yeah, it is a decent argument until you go back to what we talked about earlier in the episode with out-of-band payments, right? Because if there is monetary gain to be had with mining these transactions and also minting maybe inscriptions or ordinals or other things or any other kind of use of arbitrary data, those will find a way to get into the block so long as they conform to consensus. So then this opens up another rabbit hole for this argument that I don't think we'll cover today, almost merits its own episode. But I mean, really, both of these sides, at least the anti-side, I think they have the burden of releasing some sort of client where you change Bitcoin's consensus to where you make that 83 byte limit or completely do away with OPReTURN to make it, conform to Bitcoin's consensus rules. Like if you want this to if you really want to make these changes and you don't just want to use these filters that don't really end up working and actually end up harming the network in the long term, then you need to change Bitcoin consensus entirely to do away with these transactions, right? And I don't think anyone's ready for that conversation. There's already kind of been some rumblings about it, and it would ultimately result in a fork. I actually think there was Samson Mao was on a podcast recently advocating for something like this, right? And I just don't think that that's a hill that anyone needs to die on. It seems to make no sense to me.
Yeah. We haven't touched on many things which we can or don't have to go into, but like one of them is this alternative client, Bitcoin Knots, is a fork of Bitcoin Core that Luke Dash Jr. maintains, and he's the sole maintainer of. He's been doing this, and it takes a very opinionated stance on how he thinks Bitcoin should run. And there's a lot of people switching to it. In fact, we're at like 7 to maybe 8% of all reachable nodes running Knots. Again, this is a difficult metric to fully evaluate, but it's definitely increased and comes along with social support for it. But like this is a client, it's a fork of Core that Luke has been very, very disingenuous about, if I'm going to use very soft language, about who works on and how the client works. But regardless, when you have while I personally like client diversity, when you have a single maintainer and a significant portion of the ecosystem using that, now you have very few eyeballs on an alternative client, which does risk accidentally forking. I think this is actually probably a greater risk than most Knots users realize, which is because of oversights or deviations, as Knots takes much more opinionated stances against Core, we could see an accidental either through just deviation in policy or accidental oversight, lack of oversight. We could see an inadvertent fork, which I don't think anybody wants. I would prefer for an intentional fork if there is a split in a core ideology about what Bitcoin should look like. Accidental forks are almost always undesirable.
For those who don't know, that implementation by Luke is the one that currently has filters in place for certain inscriptions and ordinals. Funnily enough, some of them actually make it past the filter and still corrupt the blockchain. But it's a good example of a technical implementation where all of these philosophical ideas converge around, right? And I do just want to make one last point on how Knots and Luke Dasher, or at least Dasher through Knots, makes this argument for why this is more technically sound. But I will say, just going back to some of the previous comments I made, that argument is really mired in a kind of emotional reaction and I would say fear mongering. And I think this is best illustrated by some of Luke's tweets on the subject. With regards to relaxing the OPReTURN limit, he tweeted, and I quote, Jameson Lop was literally rubbing it in our faces that he fully intends to rape us. This isn't just some disagreement. They are literally committing violence against Bitcoiners, end quote. I don't know what else to say about that. If you're a listener and you agree with that, I think you need to actually think about what actual aggressive physical sexual assault is. Comparing that with including arbitrary data on Bitcoin that some people don't like, to me, is just so foolish and such absurd sophistry that I think you can almost completely disregard any other arguments coming from this camp, because I don't really see how you look past that.
I agree with you, Colin. We're going to wrap it up there. Thanks so much for listening to Bitcoin Season 2. I'm Charlie Spears. That's Colin Harper. Make sure to follow us on social media at CB Spears and at Azalea Hodling. You've been listening to Bitcoin Season 2. Follow us at BTCSZN2 and Blockspace Pod. See you all next week.